The bugle cried its mournful note across the park, the kind of sound that sinks deep into your bones and reminds you of everything you lost and everything you carried home. I stood in silence, my hand resting on a small bouquet of wildflowers placed at the base of the memorial wall. Each name etched into stone felt like a voice still speaking, reminding me of the price we paid. This was supposed to be a morning of remembrance, of quiet reverence. But then a voice cut through the hush behind me. "You are not in any records, you are an imposter." The words slammed into me harder than the recoil of any weapon I ever fired. Heads turned, eyes locked on me. In a moment meant to honor the fallen, I had become the accused. My pulse hammered, not out of fear, but out of a deeper truth I had kept buried. I knew if it ever came to light, it would change everything. Before we dive into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if stories of courage and resilience speak to you. Share in the comments where you are listening from and what hour it is in your corner of the world. It is always moving to see how far these stories travel and whose hearts they reach. What happened that day did not end with a single accusation. Word spread quickly, rippling through the community of veterans like wildfire. Soon I was summoned to stand before a hall full of men and women who had served their country, a place where honor is currency and truth is weighed heavier than metals. It felt less like a gathering and more like a trial, and I was the one on the stand. The silence after the accusation was heavier than the sound of the bugle had been only moments earlier. People shifted uneasily, some whispering, others staring openly. I felt their eyes crawling across my back, searching for cracks in my posture, clues in my face. In the quiet between heartbeats, I realized this was not going to end with one man's words tossed carelessly into the air. It would grow like a spark finding dry brush. I kept my chin high. Though inside my chest it felt like a door had slammed shut on the secret I had kept for years. I thought of the names on the memorial wall, of the vows whispered in the dust of foreign battlefields. Those promises had no room for showmanship or defense, yet here I was, pulled into the light against my will. After the ceremony, people approached me not with the warmth of comrades, but with measured curiosity. Some asked in roundabout ways about my service. Others stood at a distance with narrowed eyes. It reminded me of being back on deployment, when you could feel the tension rise before the first shot was fired. Everyone knew something was coming. By the end of that week, the whispers had become statements. I heard that I was pretending, that I was claiming honors I never earned. Someone said I wore insignia that did not belong to me. Another claimed I had invented entire missions that never took place. Lies travel faster than truth, especially when the truth is hidden behind locked doors and sealed files. One evening, as I stood in the small kitchen of my home making tea, I got the call. A familiar voice, the commander of our local VFW post, asked me to attend a special meeting. His tone was calm, but I could hear the weight behind it. They wanted me to come forward to answer questions. It was framed as an opportunity to clear things up, but I knew better. It was a summons. And the hall would feel less like a gathering place and more like a courtroom. I set the phone down slowly, the steam from my mug fogging the window above the sink. Outside, the night pressed close, the kind that carries the smell of earth and pine. I wondered if any of the people spreading rumors had ever dragged a bleeding man across the sand under fire, or had looked into a friend's eyes as the light dimmed too soon. Honor and truth were not abstract ideas to me. They were bone-deep scars, etched into muscle memory, but none of that mattered if I could not speak of it. There is a strange loneliness in knowing something you cannot say. For years, I had lived with the silence of classified missions, of names that could never be written, of places that were wiped off reports as though they had never existed. And now I was being accused precisely because I had respected that silence. The night before the meeting, I barely slept. Memories replayed themselves like old reels of film, grainy and relentless. The desert heat, the hum of rotors overhead. The copper taste of adrenaline, the laughter of Marines teasing me for carrying a med pack bigger than my frame. The moment when laughter turned to shouts, when shouts turned to silence, and I realized the only thing between life and death for some of them was my hands. By morning, I was exhausted but steady. I put on a plain blouse and slacks, no medals, no visible insignia. I was not there to flaunt anything. I drove to the hall with the windows cracked. The spring air cool against my face, trying to calm the restless rhythm of my pulse. The VFW hall sat at the edge of town, brick walls weathered by decades of service and memory. Flags lined the entrance, fluttering slightly in the breeze. As I stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and old wood polish. Rows of chairs had been set up, and already the room was filling with men and women in jackets adorned with patches, caps that bore the years of their service. Conversations hushed when I walked in. I could feel the weight of their gazes, some sympathetic, others skeptical, a few outright hostile. It reminded me of standing in formation, waiting for inspection, only this time it was not my uniform under scrutiny, but my very identity. The commander greeted me with a nod, his lined face unreadable. He directed me to a seat near the front. On the wall behind him hung photographs of local veterans. Black and white fading into color, decades of service captured in still frames. I wondered if my face would ever belong among them or if I would remain an outsider, questioned and doubted. The meeting began with the usual recitations, the pledge, the acknowledgement of those we had lost. For a fleeting moment, I hoped the gravity of tradition might soften what was coming. But soon enough, the tone shifted. The commander cleared his throat and addressed the room. There have been concerns raised about the service record of one of our members. Tonight, we are here to allow her to respond. His words fell like a gavel. The room turned toward me. My mouth was dry, but I forced myself to stand. The faces blurred together, a sea of expectation and suspicion. I spoke simply at first, stating my years of service, my role as a Navy hospital corpsman, my deployments alongside Marine units, but before I could continue, questions erupted. Where were you stationed? Who was your commanding officer? Why are your records incomplete if you were attached to recon? Why has no one verified it? Each question landed sharp, some asked with genuine curiosity, others with clear disbelief. I answered what I could, careful not to cross the line of classified information, but the more I withheld, the more it looked like evasion. One man stood, his voice rough with age. I served 20 years and I can account for every day of it. If you really did what you claim, why can't you prove it? The sting was not in the words themselves, but in the ripple they caused. Heads nodded, doubt thickened. I wanted to shout that I had proof inked into my very skin, that my scars were maps of places most of them had never seen. I wanted to show them the letter folded in a box at home, written by a Marine who lived because I had refused to leave him behind. But some things were never meant for public eyes. So I stood there, heart pounding, and let their questions wash over me. It felt less like a meeting and more like an interrogation, yet the cruelty was unintentional. They were defending the sanctity of service, protecting the weight of their own sacrifices. In their eyes, I was a threat to that unless I could prove otherwise. At one point, I caught the gaze of a woman across the room, her hair silver, her posture straight. She gave me a small nod, barely perceptible, but it steadied me. There were those who knew what it meant to carry untold stories, even if they could not name them aloud. I told them quietly but firmly that not all service is visible. Some of us walk in shadows, not for glory, but because the mission demands it. That did not satisfy everyone, but it was the closest I could come to the truth without betraying promises carved into silence. As the questions continued, I wondered if any of them realized the irony. They demanded clarity from me, yet many of them carried their own locked boxes of memory, stories too painful or too classified to share. Maybe the difference was that theirs were believed while mine was doubted. The commander eventually called for a pause, his voice calm but firm. The room settled, though the tension lingered. He announced they would take further time to consider what had been said and reconvene later if necessary. Relief and dread tangled inside me. This was not over, not by a long shot, and deep down, I knew the real trial had only just begun. When the meeting broke into uneasy silence, I slipped out into the cool night air. The parking lot lights cast long shadows, and for a moment I felt like one of them, stretched and distorted, not quite belonging to the shape that cast it. A few people approached me as I walked to my car. Some were polite, offering words like "give it time" or "they just don't understand." Others were blunt, telling me straight out that until I could prove my record, I had no place among them. Each voice lingered like an echo long after I closed the car door. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, the leather worn smooth under my palms. Part of me wanted to drive straight home, lock the door, and disappear into the quiet safety of my own four walls. But another part of me knew there was no hiding now. The whispers had teeth, and they were already biting deeper into my life. The next morning, I went to the small diner downtown for breakfast, a place I had been going for years. The waitress, who had always greeted me with a smile, hesitated when she set down my coffee. A man at the counter leaned toward his friend, not bothering to lower his voice, and said, "That's the woman who pretends she was recon." My fork froze halfway to my mouth. The accusation had already left the confines of the VFW hall and found its way into the streets of my town. Everywhere I went that week, I felt the sting of suspicion. The grocery store, the post office, even the church where I sometimes lit candles for the fallen. It was as if my entire existence had been put on trial, and though no judge had spoken, the jury of neighbors and strangers alike was already deliberating. At night, sleep came in fragments. I would drift off only to wake to the phantom sound of helicopters, the remembered weight of sand filling my boots, the echo of a voice calling for a corpseman. I would lie there staring at the ceiling, trying to steady my breath, wondering how much longer I could endure being torn between silence and survival. By the time the second VFW meeting was called, the tension had become unbearable. This time, the hall was even more crowded, word having spread that there would be answers. The commander's expression was grave as he opened the floor. I could feel the expectation pressing in from every corner, the hunger for clarity, for proof. I stood once more, my hands steady even as my heart pounded. I spoke of the oath I had taken, of the men I had served beside, of the moments when saving a life mattered more than any title or recognition. But again the questions came, sharper now, more insistent. What unit exactly were you attached to? What operations can you name? Why does no one else step forward to confirm your service? I gave what I could. I named bases I had legitimately been stationed at, roles I had fulfilled. But when pressed for mission specifics, I shook my head. Some things remain in the dark because bringing them into the light endangers more than one person. That answer did not sit well with them. A man rose from the back, his chest heavy with medals. His voice was stern, his eyes narrow. "If you cannot provide evidence, then you dishonor all of us who bled for this country." Those words cut deeper than I expected. Dishonor. It was a brand, a scarlet letter that no veteran ever wanted to wear. The murmurs grew louder, the mood shifting toward hostility. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to speak over the noise. You think silence is a lie, but sometimes silence is the only shield we have. That earned me a few nods, but more frowns. Just when it seemed the tide would swallow me whole, an older man near the front cleared his throat. His hair was white, his back straight despite the years. I recognized him instantly. Colonel Hale, retired Marine. Once my commanding officer during a deployment no one else in that room knew had taken place. His presence alone froze the whispers. He looked around the room, his gaze sharp. "I served with this woman. I know where she has been, and I know what she has done." His words carried the weight of decades of authority, but before he could continue, another voice shouted from the back. "Then why is her record clean? Why does nothing match?" The room split into factions, some demanding proof, others urging respect for Hale's word. The commander struggled to maintain order. I stood there in the middle, the storm swirling around me, feeling as if I might be ripped apart. Colonel Hale raised a hand for silence. "There are reasons records are sealed," he said. "Reasons you may never know, but I will tell you this. She saved lives. I saw it with my own eyes. That is all you need to know." Gasps and murmurs followed, but before the moment could settle, someone slammed a hand against a table. "This is not enough. If we let anyone claim glory with no evidence, we betray our oath." The anger in his voice sparked more debate, louder than before. I felt my chest tighten. Hale's defense was powerful, but would it be enough? I knew that no matter what he said, doubt would linger. The room was no longer just a hall of veterans. It was a crucible, and I was burning inside it. The commander finally called the meeting to a close, his voice heavy with frustration. "We will reconvene once more," he said. "Until then, no conclusions will be drawn." The gavel hit the table, and just like that, the trial was adjourned. But as I walked out into the night, I realized the verdict had already been written in many minds. Some saw me as vindicated by Hale's presence. Others saw me as a fraud hiding behind the word of a respected man. Either way, the battle was far from over. On the drive home, the headlights carved tunnels through the darkness. My grip on the wheel was iron tight. I thought of the missions, the blood, the faces I could never name. I thought of the vow I had taken to remain silent. And I thought of the eyes that looked at me now not with respect but with suspicion. The past was knocking harder than ever, demanding to be heard, and deep inside, I knew that to survive this trial, I would have to open doors I had kept locked for years. The kind of doors that once opened can never be closed again. As the night closed in around me, I whispered a silent promise to myself. If they want the truth, then they will have it. But the truth has a cost, and I was not sure any of us were ready to pay it. That was the moment I understood. The next chapter of my life would not be written in peace. It would be carved out of the shadows of my past in stories I never intended to tell. And once I began, there would be no turning back. The VFW hall still smelled faintly of old wood and coffee when I returned for the next meeting. I sat on one of the metal folding chairs near the front, my palms flat against my knees to keep them steady. The commander called us to order, and the sound of chairs scraping across the floor filled the space like a drum roll. I could feel the weight of expectation pressing in. This was not just a gathering anymore. It was a trial in all but name. Men and women, each bearing their own scars and medals, were looking at me as if I held a secret they had the right to uncover. And in a way, they did. The first to rise was a Vietnam veteran, his voice gravelly from years of smoke and memory. If you say you served with Marine Recon, prove it. Tell us where and when. His demand was sharp, not cruel, but filled with the exhaustion of a man who had seen too many impostors claim glory. My throat tightened. I had sworn to stay silent. But silence had become its own weapon, turned against me. I drew a long breath, and for the first time I began to speak of the path that had led me here. I joined the Navy in 2010, I said. I was 20 years old, stubborn and hungry for purpose. I signed on as a hospital corpsman, trained in emergency medicine, and from the start I knew it would not be easy. The words felt strange at first, like opening a locked chest after years of hiding it away. Faces softened slightly, though the doubt was still there. Another veteran asked why a corpsman would be with Marine Recon. I nodded, prepared for the question. They needed medics who could move with them, who could keep pace in the most hostile terrain. We were trained not only to patch wounds, but to carry rifles, to keep a team alive when every second mattered. The memories came rushing back, vivid as the desert heat. I told them of training at Camp Lejeune, where I learned to rappel cliffs and swim rivers in full gear, my pack heavier than my own body weight. I remembered nights when I collapsed into my bunk too tired to dream, only to wake before dawn and do it all over again. Someone scoffed, training is one thing, but combat is another. I didn't flinch. I told them about the first time I deployed, somewhere in the Middle East, though I would not name the country. We had been dropped into a valley where the wind carried more dust than air. Our mission was simple in words, but brutal in execution. Secure intelligence, protect the team, and come home alive. I saw some nodding, others folding their arms tighter. I leaned into the memory, letting it carry me. One night, gunfire cracked through the stillness like breaking glass. We were ambushed, pinned down by insurgents who knew the land better than we did. A Marine to my left took a round to the chest. I crawled to him, rounds whipping past, and pressed my hands against the wound. My gloves were soaked before I could even pull the bandage free. I worked in the dirt, the sand mixing with blood, praying to any god who was listening. He lived, barely, but he lived. I told them how I carried him back under fire, how I felt the bullet graze my shoulder, leaving a scar that no one could see beneath my uniform. A hush fell over the hall. For the first time, their eyes held not just suspicion, but something else. Recognition, that moment when veterans realize the language is familiar, when the details ring true. Still, another voice rose, if that's real. Where is it in the records? I met his gaze. Not everything makes it into records. Not every life saved is written down. Some stories stay buried because the missions themselves never existed on paper. I could feel the divide sharpening again. Some wanted to believe, others refused. That was when I lifted my sleeve, revealing the faded ink on my forearm. The design was simple but carried weight to those who knew. It marked a unit, a deployment, a bond that only those who had been there could understand. Gasps filled the room, whispers spreading like wildfire. A few men exchanged looks, their faces pale. One of them muttered that he had seen that same ink once, years ago, on a Marine who never spoke of his past. I did not linger on it. The tattoo was not a trophy, but a scar etched into my skin. I lowered my sleeve and continued. That mark is the only record I need. It is not proof for the world, but it is proof enough for me. The commander's eyes softened. Tell us more, he urged, so I did. I spoke of carrying stretchers through the dark, of stitching wounds by the faint glow of a flashlight, of writing letters for men who never got to send them. I told them about the silence after a firefight when you count breaths and hope you are not counting wrong. I did not give dates, names, or locations. I couldn't. But I gave them the truth in the only way I knew how, through memory, through the raw edge of lived experience. When I paused, the hall was quiet. No one moved, no one coughed. It was as if every soul in that room was balancing on the same fragile silence. I realized then that this was only the beginning. The more I revealed, the more they would demand. The truth was a heavy door, and I had only just cracked it open. Behind it lay stories darker and more dangerous, stories that explained not just why my record was empty, but why my silence had lasted this long. As I looked around the room, I knew there was no going back. The trial was still in motion, and I was still the one in the center. But for the first time, I felt something shift inside me. The shame of being doubted had begun to turn into the resolve of being heard. And if they wanted the truth, then I would give it to them. All of it. Before I tell you what happened next, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. It matters to know who is listening, and sometimes it helps to remember that none of us carry our stories alone. The silence inside the hall pressed in like a storm about to break. I steadied myself, knowing the next words would carry me past a line I could never retreat from. They wanted proof, and I could give them only what lived in my memory. There was a mission, I began, my voice lower, the words pulled from a place I rarely touched. We were deployed into a region no one names on record, a place where the desert swallows both footprints and truth. The terrain was sharp and merciless, jagged cliffs cutting into the sky. Recon had been tasked with securing intelligence that could change the course of operations in the area. I was there as their corpsman, but also as part of them. We moved at night, guided by stars and whispers over comms. The air smelled of dust and oil fires that had burned for months. I carried a pack heavier than I had ever trained for, stocked with bandages, Roman 4, morphine, and a rifle slung tight across my chest. Every step felt like I was walking on the edge of something fragile. Halfway through the valley, it happened. The ambush. Shots lit the dark, sudden and merciless. Tracers streaked the sky like angry red comets. One of our men went down instantly, and another fell beside him, blood spilling into the sand. My body moved before thought. I crawled forward, bullets snapping the air, my hands already working to stop the bleeding. I told them how I pressed gauze into a chest wound so deep I felt the heartbeat pulsing against my palm. How I whispered to him to hold on while my own shoulder burned where shrapnel tore through. I injected morphine with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Then I dragged him by his vest toward cover, every inch feeling like a mile. The hall was utterly still. Even the air seemed to pause as I continued. We were outnumbered, I said. Reinforcements weren't coming. It was just us holding the line. I will never forget the sound of the sergeant's voice barking orders, steady and calm even as the world collapsed around us. We fought until dawn, until our ammo was nearly gone, until silence fell heavier than the gunfire. In that silence we counted. 12 of us went in, 9 walked out. 3 names etched forever into my memory, 3 men I could not save. I see their faces every time I close my eyes. I paused, letting the weight of that settle, and then I told them the part that explained the missing records. That mission never existed, not officially. The men we lost, the intel we secured, even the valley itself, it all vanished from paper. Our reports were classified, then erased. We were told never to speak of it, not to family, not to fellow service members, not even to one another. We lived it, but on record, it was as if it never happened. Why? A voice asked from the back. Because sometimes truth is too dangerous. Sometimes admitting you were there reveals more than the government is willing to risk. They sealed it away. Buried it deep, and with it, they buried us too. I rolled up my sleeve again, letting them see the faded ink. After the mission, those of us who survived marked ourselves, not for glory, not for show, but because we needed something real, something that could not be erased. This tattoo is not a boast. It is a memorial, a promise. A murmur spread through the hall. Some veterans nodded slowly, recognizing the language of grief and memory. Others looked unsettled, struggling between belief and doubt. I told them about the aftermath, how I spent weeks in a hospital bed with stitches in my shoulder and nightmares worse than the pain. How I signed papers that meant I could never speak of what I had seen. How I walked out of that hospital to a world that had no idea where I had been. That was the first time I understood what it meant to serve in silence, to bear scars invisible to anyone who hadn't been there, to carry a story no one wanted to hear because officially it never happened. I lifted my gaze to the room, so when you ask why there are no records, that is your answer. My service is not written on paper. It is written in scars, in the lives I saved, and in the ghosts I carry. The hall was hushed, but not empty. The weight of my words lingered. I could see it in their faces, the recognition, the unease, the pull between pride and doubt. Some eyes softened with respect, others hardened, unwilling to let go of suspicion. I pressed on, my voice steady but low. If you think I stand here for recognition, you are wrong. I stand here because I was accused of dishonor, and I will not let the silence that was once my shield become my noose. The commander leaned forward, his eyes searching mine. Why now? Why speak of this after all these years? Because I said the truth may be buried, but it is not dead. And if I have to stand here and carry it alone, I will. The hall erupted into debates. Some veterans stood, clapping slowly, while others argued fiercely that stories without documents are stories only. The noise swelled until the commander banged his gavel against the table. Enough, he barked. We will recess. This matter is not settled. The meeting dissolved in waves of murmurs and sidelong glances. I walked out into the cold night air, my chest aching from the weight of what I had said. The stars above seemed impossibly far. But I whispered a promise to them anyway, to the men who never came home, to the truth that would not stay buried forever. The sound of boots followed me outside. I turned and saw Colonel Hale. His face was lined, his eyes weary, but there was a fire in them still. You did right to speak, he said, but be careful. Not everyone in that room is ready for the truth. Some will fight you harder now that you have spoken it. I nodded, the weight of his warning pressing heavy. I knew he was right. Speaking the truth had not ended the trial. It had only begun it. As I drove home, I thought of the ambush, of blood mixing with sand, of a young Marine's pulse beneath my fingers. I thought of the tattoo inked into my skin, the only proof I carried. And I thought of the faces in the hall, split between belief and doubt. What I did not know then was that the next meeting would not just question my past. It would force me to relive it in ways I never imagined. And the ghosts I had kept buried would no longer stay silent. Before we go further, if you are still with me, consider subscribing to the channel. Stories like this matter because they remind us of the cost of service and the weight of silence. Share your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and every word helps carry this story forward. Chapter 3 Climax, Part 1. The third meeting was unlike the others. From the moment I walked through the double doors of the VFW hall, I knew the air had changed. It was heavier, charged with something unspoken, like the silence before a storm. More chairs had been pulled in, the tables pushed back to make room. Veterans who had never attended before now sat shoulder to shoulder, their arms crossed, their eyes sharp. Word had spread. And the whispers had turned into an uproar that demanded a verdict. As I took my seat near the front, I could feel the burn of their stares. I heard fragments of conversations float above the murmur. No records, she's making it up. If it isn't on paper, it never happened. The words pricked at me like thorns, small but relentless. The commander stood, his voice steady but firm. This gathering is not for gossip, it is for truth. And tonight, the truth will be decided. The first to rise was a tall man with silver hair and a chest full of campaign ribbons. His voice cut through the hall like a blade. You have given us stories, but stories are not proof. Where are your records? Where are the names of your commanding officers? Where are the medals that would have been awarded for saving lives under fire? I swallowed hard, knowing this moment would come. Slowly, I reached into my pack and pulled out what little I had dared to keep. A faded commendation letter. Unsigned and without a date. It was meant to be delivered, but never was, caught in the limbo of a mission that officially never happened. I laid it on the table in front of me. I lifted my sleeve again, showing the ink etched into my skin. This is not decoration. It is a mark of survival, of brotherhood, of blood. Every person who carries it knows what it means. Then I set down the small silver medallion, scratched and worn, given to me by one of the Marines whose life I saved that night. He pressed it into my hand in the hospital and told me it was proof enough. The hall leaned in, eyes fixed on the table, but the silver-haired man shook his head. A tattoo is not proof, a trinket is not proof, and a letter without a signature is worth less than paper. If it is not in the records, it does not exist. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. My chest tightened. I could feel the verdict forming in the air. the weight of disbelief settling heavier with each second. I rose, my voice sharper than I intended. Records are written by men who decide what the world is allowed to know, but the truth does not vanish just because it is not stamped and filed. I bear it in my scars, in my sleepless nights, in the faces of those I saved. That is more real than ink on paper. Still, the doubt persisted. Another veteran shouted, "Then bring us someone who was there, someone besides you. Without that, your words are nothing." The room grew restless, voices overlapping, suspicion hardening like ice. For a moment, I thought this was the end, that no matter what I said, no matter what I revealed, I would leave this hall branded as a fraud. Then from the back of the room, a chair scraped against the floor. The sound cut through the noise like a signal. Heads turned. An older man stood, tall despite the years, his presence commanding the space before he even spoke. His uniform was long retired, but the way he carried himself told everyone who he had once been. Colonel James Whitaker, United States Marine Corps, retired. The crowd hushed as he walked forward, his cane tapping softly against the floor. He moved with the quiet dignity of a man who had carried both command and consequence. When he reached the front, he turned to face the room, his gaze sweeping across every skeptical eye before landing on me. "I know this woman," he said, his voice low but resonant. "I served with her." The hall froze. No one dared move. No one dared breathe. Whitaker continued, his words measured. "There was a night, years ago, in a valley none of you will find on a map. We were ambushed. Fire came from every ridge, every shadow. 3 of my men went down before we even reached cover. And in the chaos, when death felt certain, it was she who crawled through the bullets, who held their lives in her hands." He paused, his eyes far away, seeing what the rest could not. She dragged them one by one to safety. She bled with them, fought beside them, and refused to leave until the last man was breathing. I watched her save 3 Marines that night. I watched her turn loss into survival. A ripple of shock ran through the crowd, but even I could not write it down, Whitaker said, his voice heavy with regret. The mission was classified beyond classification. My own report was redacted until it was nothing but black lines. The names of the wounded were scrubbed from records. Even my memory was supposed to be sealed, but I remember. And I will not stand silent while her honor is dragged through the dirt. The hall was utterly silent. You could hear the hum of the old fluorescent lights overhead, the creak of wood as someone shifted in their chair. Every eye was fixed on him, every breath held in suspension. Whitaker turned, his gaze locking with mine. "You have carried this burden alone long enough. Tonight it is mine to share." I felt my throat tighten, emotion rising sharp and unexpected. For years, I had stood in silence, bearing the weight of ghosts with no witness. Now, for the first time, someone else spoke it aloud. The commander cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. "Colonel, are you certain?" Whitaker straightened, the fire of command flickering in his eyes. "I am certain, and if you doubt me, then you doubt every medal on my chest." No one spoke, no one dared. The truth hung in the air, undeniable, unshakable. In that moment, the trial was no longer about me alone. It was about all of us, about the stories buried beneath black ink, about the sacrifices erased by secrecy. And for the first time, I felt the tide turn. Before I share what happened next, if this story has reached you, take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment. These memories are heavy, but every listener helps carry the weight a little farther. The silence after Colonel Whitaker's words was not gentle. It was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the entire hall had been wrapped in a shroud. Every pair of eyes darted between him and me, torn between disbelief and awe. I could feel the shift in the air, but it was not unanimous. Where some faces softened, others hardened. A man in the second row stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the wooden floor. He was younger than Whitaker, maybe in his 60s. But his eyes burned with skepticism. "With all due respect, Colonel, stories are not evidence. Without paper, without record, how do we know this isn't just loyalty speaking?" Whitaker's jaw tightened. He leaned slightly on his cane, but his voice was iron. "You weren't there. You didn't hear the rounds crack past your head. You didn't watch her drag a Marine twice her size through blood and sand. I did." The skeptic shook his head, unwilling to yield. "Then why was she never recognized? Why no medal, no citation, no mention in even a redacted file?" "Because," Whitaker said, his tone sharp as glass, "we were ordered into silence. The mission was buried deeper than the graves of the men who fell that night. Recognition was sacrificed for secrecy. That does not erase what she did." The hall stirred, a tide of voices rising. Some nodded in agreement, while others whispered harshly that it was too convenient, too neatly hidden. I sat in the middle, the storm raging around me, my heart pounding in time with their doubts. Then another voice rang out. This time it was a woman, her hair streaked gray, her posture proud. "I served in Iraq," she said. "I know what it feels like to be overlooked, to have your contribution erased because it didn't fit the story they wanted to tell. You don't need records to know the truth, you just need to listen." Her words rippled through the room. A reminder that silence had robbed many of their recognition, not just me. Heads turned, the murmur softening, though not entirely vanishing. The commander raised a hand, demanding order. "The floor belongs to Colonel Whitaker." "Continue." Whitaker's gaze swept across the hall, steady and unflinching. "That night," he said, "I remember 3 Marines bleeding out in the dust. I remember the panic in their eyes, the way the air itself seemed to burn. And I remember her hands, steady in the chaos, pulling them back from the brink. If you doubt her, then you doubt me. And if you doubt me, then perhaps you doubt the very idea of service itself." The words landed like a hammer. Even those who resisted shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to challenge the weight of his authority. For a moment, no one spoke. Then from the far back came a bitter laugh. It was sharp, cutting, the kind of sound meant to break the fragile unity forming in the room. An older veteran stood, his uniform jacket stretched tight across his chest. "You all want to believe in heroes," he sneered, "but heroes leave footprints. They leave citations, records, medals. They don't just vanish into shadows. Without proof, this is nothing more than a fairy tale." The tension snapped back like a whip. Murmurs of agreement rose again, clashing with those who had begun to believe. The hall divided before my eyes, half leaning toward faith, half clinging to doubt. Whitaker's voice thundered over them. "Fairy tales don't leave scars. Look at her. Look at the ink she carries, the silence she has borne. She shouldered what most of you never will. That is not fantasy, that is sacrifice." All eyes turned to me again. I felt the heat of their scrutiny, the sharp edge of their judgment. Slowly, I rolled up my sleeve, bearing the tattoo once more. Then, with trembling fingers, I tugged at the collar of my blouse, revealing the faint, puckered scar along my shoulder where shrapnel had torn through. The hall hushed. Even the skeptic who had laughed fell silent, his mouth half open. "This is what was left," I said quietly. "Not medals, not certificates, just scars and the memory of carrying lives in my hands." For a long moment, no one moved. It felt as though the room itself was holding its breath. Then, one by one, chairs began to scrape. Veterans rose slowly to their feet, not all of them. Some stayed seated, their arms crossed tight, their disbelief carved deep, but others stood. Their eyes shining, their heads bowed in respect. The sound of boots on the wooden floor echoed softly, like a heartbeat spreading through the room. The commander finally spoke, his voice thick with something more than authority. "Enough. Tonight we have heard what cannot be erased. You may choose to believe or not, but you cannot say you were not told." The hall was silent again, but it was not the silence of doubt. It was the silence of reckoning. The kind that comes when truth has been laid bare, raw and unpolished, and all that remains is the weight of it pressing down on every soul present. Whitaker placed a hand on my shoulder. "You do not stand alone anymore." For the first time in years, I believed him. After the silence of that night at the VFW, I expected the storm to scatter. I thought the crowd would go home, tuck away their doubts or their respect, and let the story fade like smoke into the wind. But the days that followed told me otherwise. Something had shifted, and not just inside me. The very next morning, I found an envelope slipped under my door. No return address, no name. Inside was a folded letter on yellowed stationery. The handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. I too was ordered into silence. I too carried a story no one believed. And at the bottom, just 2 words, "Thank you." By the end of the week, I had 3 more. Notes from men and women I barely knew, each confessing their own version of being erased. Some spoke of missions stripped from the record. Others of sacrifices that went unacknowledged because they wore the wrong uniform, carried the wrong name, or belonged to the wrong gender. Every letter was a piece of proof, not for the world but for me, proof that I was not alone. Then came the conversations in parking lots and quiet corners of grocery stores. A woman I had seen countless times at the post office leaned close and whispered that she had once been attached to a unit in Afghanistan, running logistics that no one spoke of. A man at the hardware store told me he had been decorated, then stripped of recognition when his command changed. Their voices trembled with something I recognized well, the ache of being unseen. Soon it was no longer whispers. Small gatherings began, first in living rooms, then in borrowed church basements. Veterans who had carried silence for decades sat together for the first time and let their truths breathe. We were not a club, not an official association. We were a circle of ghosts refusing to stay buried. One night, as we sat in a drafty hall with coffee cups steaming in our hands, I realized how much had changed. Women who had never spoken of their service before now shared details in halting words, their eyes wet but their backs straight. Men admitted that they had doubted me at first, only to realize their own stories carried the same fractures, the same missing lines in the history books. We decided to give ourselves a name, not for publicity, but for belonging, the Silent Ones. It was simple, honest, and it carried the weight of our shared truth. We formed a private group, a way to stay connected beyond these walls. We shared resources for those struggling with health care, contacts for counseling, and sometimes just a phone call when the nights were too heavy. It was not about proving ourselves to the world anymore. It was about proving to one another that we were real, and that was enough. But something else stirred in me during those gatherings, a new kind of courage, different from the courage it took to crawl through bullets or face down a room full of skeptics. It was the courage to speak, not just for myself, but for the ones who never would. The first invitation came from a local high school. A history teacher had heard about the controversy at the VFW and asked if I would speak to her class about what service really meant. I almost said no. Standing before teenagers with bright eyes and little understanding of war felt more daunting than any ambush I had ever faced. But I went. I stood in front of 30 students, their notebooks open, their pens ready, and I told them about the meaning of service. I didn't talk about politics or medals or ranks. I told them about holding a life in your hands, about the silence after a firefight, about the weight of memory. I told them that courage is not just running toward danger, but standing in truth when it would be easier to stay quiet. When I finished, the room was hushed. Then one girl raised her hand. She asked if women could really do what men did in combat. I looked at her, saw the doubt and the hope mixed together in her eyes, and I said yes. Not because it is easy, not because the world is ready to accept it, but because strength does not wear a uniform reserved for men. Strength belongs to whoever carries it. The applause that followed was small, but it was real. Afterward, a boy lingered as the others left. He told me his sister wanted to enlist, but their family doubted her. He said hearing me made him believe in her in a way he hadn't before. His words stayed with me long after the classroom was empty. That night, I lay awake thinking about the ripple of one voice, how a single story spoken aloud could shift something in a stranger's heart, how truth once whispered could travel farther than silence ever would. Before I share how far those ripples reached, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if these stories matter to you. Not for me, but for the silent ones whose voices deserve to be heard beyond the shadows. The ripples did not stop at the high school. Within weeks, I received another invitation, this time from a community college in the neighboring town. Then a veteran outreach center called. Soon my phone rang with numbers I did not recognize, each one carrying a request. Could I come and share my story? Could I sit with families who did not understand why their daughters enlisted? Could I speak to civic groups about what it means to live with unseen scars? Each time I hesitated, remembering the silence I had once believed was my only shield, and each time I went. What began as whispers in back rooms had become a widening circle, one that demanded courage of a different kind. At the community college, I stood before a room filled not just with students, but with veterans trying to find their place in civilian life. Some carried service dogs at their sides, some wore jackets heavy with patches, and others sat with folded arms, guarded and weary. I spoke not as a lecturer, but as a fellow traveler, someone who had carried silence too long. I told them about the night the accusation shattered my world, about the trial in the VFW hall, and about how truth is not always carved into official records. One man in the back raised his hand. He said he had spent 2 tours in Iraq running convoys that were never acknowledged, and for years he felt invisible. When he spoke, his voice cracked, but his shoulders lifted as if a weight had shifted. For the first time in public, he admitted he was proud. That moment was worth more than any standing ovation. Soon our small group, the silent ones, grew larger. What began with letters and hushed confessions turned into monthly meetings, then biweekly gatherings. We created a secure online space guarded by trust where veterans from across the country joined. Some were women who had been attached to special operations units as medics, linguists, or analysts, their contributions buried under layers of classification. Some were men whose sacrifices were lost in the shuffle of bureaucracy. Each new voice was like a puzzle piece fitting into a larger picture, a community that had always existed but never had a name. I remember one meeting in particular. A woman named Denise stood up. She was small, almost fragile in appearance, with silver hair cut short and steady eyes. She told us about working as an interpreter during missions in Afghanistan, how her knowledge of Dari had saved countless lives, but how her name was never recorded in official reports. For decades, she carried that silence, fearing no one would believe her. When she finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Denise wept openly, and I realized that what we were building was not just recognition, but healing. News of our gatherings spread quietly but steadily. Local newspapers began to cover our meetings, framing them as community healing circles rather than confrontations. A regional veterans magazine ran a feature on the silent ones, calling us the voices history forgot. We never sought the spotlight, but the light found us anyway. With attention came skepticism. Some called us storytellers chasing sympathy, others accused us of fabricating tales to earn recognition we did not deserve. I had lived through that doubt before. And now I understood how to face it, not with anger, but with persistence. We did not fight to prove ourselves to skeptics. We spoke for those who were still silent, who might never step forward but needed to know they were not alone. The first time I stood on a stage at a National Veterans Conference, my hands trembled. The ballroom was filled with hundreds of faces, some friendly, some skeptical. I began not with my own story, but with the stories entrusted to me. I spoke of the silent ones, of the medics who carried men from the line of fire only to be erased from reports, of the interpreters who bridged languages but not recognition, of the convoy drivers whose names were never attached to the lives they saved. I looked out and saw tears in the eyes of men who had served before me, of women who had been doubted as I was. The applause that followed was thunderous, but what mattered most were the conversations after. People approached me with their own confessions, their own missing chapters. I realized this movement was no longer mine alone. It belonged to all of us. In the months that followed, our circle grew beyond what I ever imagined. Nonprofit organizations reached out, offering partnerships. Universities asked for panels. High schools invited veterans to speak in classrooms across the state. What began as a trial in a single VFW hall had transformed into a chorus. One night, sitting in my small kitchen with coffee cooling beside me, I looked at the stack of letters and emails that had arrived. Stories from Maine to California, from men and women who wanted their truth heard. It struck me that silence had once been our prison, but now our voices were our freedom. Of course, not every moment was easy. Some veterans still questioned my story, clinging to the belief that without paperwork there could be no proof. Others dismissed us entirely. Yet each time doubt rose, someone else stepped forward with testimony that could not be ignored. An old Marine recon officer who remembered the night I dragged a wounded man across open ground. A former intelligence officer who recalled Denise's flawless translation under fire. These voices wove together into a fabric no skeptic could unravel. I began to understand something profound. Recognition was not about medals or parades. It was about being seen, being remembered, and knowing that the sacrifices made in the dark had not been in vain. It was about leaving a legacy not of silence, but of truth. The silent ones became more than a group. We became a movement, not loud, not flashy, but steady like a heartbeat. We stood in schools, in auditoriums, in town halls, speaking not for validation, but for connection. Each time I spoke, I carried with me the voices of those who still could not. One evening, after a talk at a local university, a young woman approached me. She was barely 20. Her hair tied back in a simple braid, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She said she had always dreamed of joining the military, but her family told her it was not a place for women. Hearing me speak had changed something inside her. She said she would enlist, not because she wanted glory, but because she wanted to serve. Her eyes shone with determination, and I realized that perhaps the greatest legacy of the silent ones was not in the past, but in the future. Before I share the moment when our message reached farther than we ever imagined, take a moment to subscribe and share this video. These stories are not just mine, they are ours, and together we keep them alive. The first time I saw my name in print, I froze. It was a small piece in a local paper, tucked between articles about a county fair and a new highway proposal. The headline was simple, almost understated. Veteran speaks out about unseen service. The article did not go into classified details, nor did it mention units or operations. Instead, it described the silent ones, our gatherings, and the power of sharing what had once been unspeakable. For days, I carried that clipping folded in my pocket, not because it was proof, but because it was recognition in a world that had once denied I existed. It felt like sunlight on a scar that had long stayed hidden. Of course, with attention came new questions. Some reporters called, pushing for details they would never receive. Others wanted to know if I would go on record as a Navy SEAL, a title that was never mine to claim. Each time I said the same words. I was a hospital corpsman, attached to Marine Recon who served where I was needed. I never pretended to be something I was not. That was my truth, and I refused to twist it into a headline. One morning, months after the first article appeared, I received a letter in the mail stamped with the seal of the Department of the Navy. My hands shook as I opened it, expecting perhaps another summons, maybe even a reprimand. Instead, the words on the page stopped me cold. Commendation Medal, awarded for meritorious service in circumstances that could not be publicly detailed. The certificate was plain, almost clinical in its language, but when I held it, I felt the weight of every moment I had doubted myself. It was not the medal itself that mattered. It was the acknowledgement that my service had not been erased completely. Somewhere, someone in the chain of command had chosen to sign their name to my story, even if only in part. When I brought the medal to the next Silent Ones meeting, the room fell silent. Some reached out to touch the ribbon as if it carried a piece of their own validation. Denise whispered that it felt like we all had been seen, even if only for a second. We understood the limitations. The medal could not tell the whole story. It could not list the nights of fire, the names of those we lost, or the secrets that would never leave our lips. But it was a marker, a small but undeniable truth. What surprised me most was not how the veterans responded, but how the community shifted. Local leaders invited me to speak not as a curiosity, but as a representative of courage. Churches asked me to share about resilience. Schools requested I talk about leadership under pressure. Slowly, the doubts that once surrounded me gave way to respect. It was not universal. Some still questioned. But the tide had turned, and I no longer felt the need to defend myself at every turn. I remember one night at the VFW hall, the same place where I had once stood accused. The commander, a man who had barely met my eyes during that painful gathering, called me to the stage. He handed me the microphone and simply said we were wrong. The room erupted in applause. I felt tears sting my eyes, not because I needed their validation, but because their respect was the only thing I had truly wanted. In that moment, I told them what I had always held inside. I said I never called myself a SEAL, because that title belonged to others, but I knew where I had been. I knew the lives I had saved, the blood I had bled, and the scars I carried. That truth could not be erased by missing paperwork or erased files. It lived in me, and it lived in those I had stood beside. The hall grew so quiet I could hear the hum of the old ceiling fans. Then one by one, men and women rose to their feet. It was not a parade, not an official salute, but something deeper. It was recognition. Raw and human, what happened afterward was unexpected. Veterans who had once doubted me began bringing their daughters, nieces, and granddaughters to hear me speak. They wanted the next generation to see that courage does not wear a single face, that sacrifice is not limited by gender. Young women began writing to me, saying they felt called to serve, not in pursuit of glory, but to follow in footsteps they now believed were theirs to take. I kept every letter. Some I placed in a small wooden box beside my bed, others I pinned to a corkboard in my study. They became reminders that our voices echo far beyond what we can see. One night, after a talk at a regional veterans center, a young Marine approached me. He could not have been more than 24, his uniform crisp, his eyes sharp but weary. He said he had once believed women had no place in special operations. After hearing my story, he realized courage has no gender. He shook my hand and said, "Thank you for proving me wrong. That was worth more than any medal." Before I share how our movement carried us to a place none of us expected, I want to ask something of you. If this story has touched your heart, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps keep these voices alive, and more importantly, it shows that these untold truths matter. I thought the medal and the standing ovation at the VFW would be the peak of this journey, but life had one last twist in store. It happened quietly, almost like the way rumors had first spread about me, except this time it wasn't whispers of doubt, it was echoes of truth. One morning, my phone buzzed with an email from a producer of a national broadcast. They had heard about the silent ones about our gatherings, and wanted to feature us in a special segment on untold stories of service. My first instinct was to say no. Exposure could bring scrutiny, and scrutiny could bring pain. But then I thought about Denise, about the young women who had written me letters, about the Marine who shook my hand and admitted his mind had changed. Their courage deserved more than silence, so I said yes. The day of the interview, cameras filled the room where we usually met in private. At first, the lens felt invasive, a stranger's eye trying to capture something sacred. But as we spoke, I realized the camera was not the enemy. It was a vessel. It was a way to carry voices farther than our small town, farther than even our own country. I told them what I had told everyone before. I was never a SEAL. I never claimed to be. I was a hospital corpsman who went where I was needed, who carried men bleeding through desert nights, who stitched wounds under fire, who bore scars that had no line in a record book. I told them about the silent ones, about how we had been scattered and forgotten until we found each other. When the segment aired, the response stunned us. Messages poured in from veterans across the country, then from allies abroad who had served alongside Americans in wars half a world away. Some wrote simply, "Thank you." Others shared stories long buried, tales of courage that had no official file. Our inbox became a river of voices, each one finding strength in another. Soon we were invited to Washington, not for a parade or a medal ceremony, but for something quieter and in some ways more profound. We stood in a committee room where lawmakers listened as we told our stories. They asked questions about recognition, about how many had been overlooked, about what silence had cost us. For the first time, I felt that the halls of power were listening, not with pity, but with responsibility. I walked out of that building with a strange peace. I knew policy would take time, maybe years. I knew many of our stories would remain classified, hidden forever. But the fact that we had been heard mattered. The fact that the silent ones had walked together into those chambers was itself a victory. Back home, life did not return to normal because normal was gone. The silent ones had grown into a network too large to be ignored. We organized retreats where veterans could gather without fear of judgment. We partnered with schools to create mentorship programs. We spoke not only of war, but of resilience, of rebuilding, of carrying love through loss. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, I sat on my porch and thought about what legacy really means. It isn't about medals or parades or even headlines. Legacy is the echo left in the lives we touch. It is the young woman who chooses to serve because she heard a story that told her she could. It is the Marine who rethinks his bias and goes on to mentor with compassion. It is the teacher who invites a veteran into the classroom so that students learn history not from books, but from voices that lived it. I used to fear that my life would vanish without a trace, erased by redacted files and missing reports. Now I understand that traces are not carved into stone, they are carried in hearts, and that is where the silent ones will live on. I think often of that day at the memorial, when a stranger's voice cut through the silence and called me a fraud. If I could go back, I would not erase that moment, because without it, there would have been no trial, no gathering, no movement. Sometimes the things that break us open are the very things that set us free. When I speak now, I tell audiences something I once whispered only to myself. I never called myself a SEAL, but I know I stood on the edge of life and death. I know I carried brothers through fire and brought them home. I know I bled for my country, even if no line in a file will ever say so. That is my truth, and no one can take it from me. The silent ones began as a circle of wounded voices. Today we are a chorus, not loud but steady, rising from every corner of the nation. We are proof that silence can be broken, that dignity can be restored, that recognition can bloom even from shadows. Before we close, I want to thank you for listening, not just with your ears, but with your hearts. If this story has spoken to you, consider subscribing and sharing it. Every time these stories are passed on, they live a little longer, reaching someone who needs them. As I sit here now, years after I first stood accused at a memorial wall, I know that honor is not bestowed by medals or paperwork. Honor is carried in the way we live, in the truths we refuse to bury, and in the voices we lift alongside our own. That is the legacy of the silent ones, and that is enough. I return to the cemetery on a gray morning, the kind where the air hangs heavy with memory. Rows of white markers stretched across the hillside like silent witnesses. I carried no speeches, no medals, only a single rose. Kneeling before the name of a friend I once held in my arms as the world burned around us, I laid the flower down and rested my hand against the cold stone. In that moment, I felt the weight of everything we had carried. The silence, the doubts, the long years of being unseen. But I also felt something stronger, truth. And truth does not vanish just because it has been hidden. Honor does not fade just because it has been questioned. Sacrifice does not disappear just because no one wrote it down. I stood there knowing this with all my heart. Women can and do stand in places once thought untouchable. We serve, we fight, we save lives, and we bear scars. Whether the records show it or not, our courage is real. And every act of service, whether in the spotlight or in the shadows, deserves to be remembered. What I have learned is simple. Silence can be broken, stories can be told, and healing begins when we choose to honor not only the names etched in stone, but the lives carried in memory. If this story moved you, subscribe to Military Revenge so more untold stories can be heard, and share in the comments what honor means to you, because honor is not a word carved in marble. It is a living promise, kept alive each time we choose to remember.